The Battle of Edgehill was the first pitched battle of the First English Civil War. It was fought near Edge Hill and Kineton in southern Warwickshire on Sunday, the 23rd of October 1642. All attempts at constitutional compromise between King Charles and Parliament broke down early in 1642. Both King and Parliament raised large armies to gain their way by force of arms. In October, at his temporary base near Shrewsbury, King Charles decided to march on London in order to force a decisive confrontation with Parliament's main army, commanded by the Earl of Essex. Late on the 22nd of October, both armies unexpectedly found the enemy to be close by. The next day, the Royalist army descended from Edge Hill to force battle. After the Parliamentary artillery opened a cannonade, the Royalists attacked. Both armies consisted mostly of inexperienced and sometimes ill-equipped troops. Many men from both sides fled or fell out to loot enemy baggage, and neither army was able to gain a decisive advantage. After the battle, King Charles resumed his march on London, but was not strong enough to overcome the defending militia before Essex's army could reinforce them. The inconclusive result of the Battle of Edgehill prevented either faction gaining a quick victory in the war, which eventually lasted 4 years. Background: when it appeared to King Charles I that no agreement with Parliament over the government of the kingdom was possible, he left London on the 2nd of March 1642 and headed for the north of England. Both Parliament and King realised that armed conflict was inevitable, and prepared to raise forces. Parliament enacted a militia ordinance, by which it claimed authority over the country's trained bands, while from his temporary capital of York, Charles rejected Parliament's 19 propositions and issued commissions of array, directing the Lord Lieutenant of each county to raise forces for the king. In the Siege of Hull, the parliamentarian garrison defied the king's authority and drove his forces away from the city. In early August, the king moved south to Lincoln and Leicester, where he secured the contents of the local armories. On the 22nd of August, he took the decisive step by raising the royal standard in Nottingham, effectively declaring war on Parliament. The Midlands were generally parliamentarian in sympathy, and few people rallied to the king there. So, having again secured the arms and equipment of the local trained bands, Charles moved to Chester and subsequently to Shrewsbury, where large numbers of recruits from Wales and the Welsh border were expected to join him. Having learned of the king's actions in Nottingham, Parliament dispatched its own army northward under the Earl of Essex, to confront the king. Essex marched first to Northampton, where he mustered almost 20,000 men. Learning of the king's move westwards, Essex then marched northwestwards towards Worcester. On the 23rd of September, in the first clash between the main Royalist and Parliamentarian armies, Royalist cavalry under Prince Rupert of the Rhine routed the cavalry of Essex's vanguard at the Battle of Powick Bridge. Nevertheless, lacking infantry, the Royalists abandoned Worcester. Prelude: by early October, the king's army was almost complete at Shrewsbury. He held a council of war, at which 2 courses of action were considered. The first was to attack Essex's army at Worcester, which had the drawback that the close country around the city would put the superior Royalist cavalry at a disadvantage. The second course, which was adopted, was to advance towards London. The intention was not to avoid battle with Essex, but to force one at an advantage. In the Earl of Clarendon's words, it was considered more counsellable to march towards London, it being morally sure that Essex would put himself in their way. Accordingly, the army left Shrewsbury on the 12th of October, gaining 2 days' start on the enemy, and moved southeast. Essex followed, but neither army had much information on the location of their enemy. By the 22nd of October, the Royalist army was quartered in the villages around Edgecote, and was threatening the parliamentarian post at Banbury. The garrison of Banbury sent messengers pleading for help to the parliamentarian garrison at Warwick Castle. Essex, who had just reached there, ordered an immediate march to Kineton to bring relief to Banbury, even though his army had straggled and not all his troops were present. That evening, there were clashes between outposts and quartermasters' parties in Kineton and the villages nearby, and the Royalists had their first inkling that Essex's army was close by. The king issued orders for his army to muster for battle on top of the escarpment of Edge Hill the following day. Essex originally intended marching straight to the relief of Banbury, but at about 8 a.m. on the 23rd of October, his outposts reported that the Cavaliers were massed on Edge Hill, 4.5 miles from Kineton. Essex deployed his army about halfway between Kineton and the Royalist army, where hedges formed a natural position. The opposing forces. There were some significant differences between the opposing armies, which were to be important to the course of the battle and its outcome. Although both were composed of very raw soldiers, they both had several experienced officers who had previously fought in the Dutch or Swedish armies during the 30 Years' War. The Royalist cavalry was superior to Parliament's cavalry at this stage of the war. Oliver Cromwell, who arrived too late in the day to take part in the battle, later wrote disparagingly to John Hampden, "Your troopers are most of them old decayed servingmen and tapsters, and the Royalists' troopers are gentlemen's sons, younger sons and persons of quality." Not only were the parliamentarian cavalry not so naturally accustomed to mounted action, but they were drilled in the Dutch tactic of firing pistols and carbines from the saddle, whereas under Rupert, the Royalist cavalry would charge sword in hand, relying on shock and weight. The parliamentarian foot soldiers, however, were better equipped than their Royalist counterparts. Several hundred of them lacked every sort of weapon apart from clubs or improvised polearms. The Royalist and parliamentarian artillery trains were roughly equally matched. Although Essex had more guns overall, many of them had lagged behind on the march. Deployments. Royalists. The Royalist right wing of cavalry and dragoons was led by Prince Rupert, with Sir John Byron in support. The King's Own Life Guard of Horse insisted on joining Rupert's front line, leaving the King with no cavalry reserve under his own command. The centre consisted of 5 tertiaries of infantry. There was a last-minute change of command when the Colonel-General, Lord Lindsay, was overruled when he wished to deploy them in Dutch formation. Simple phalanxes 8 ranks deep. Affronted, he resigned his command and took his place at the head of his own regiment of foot. Instead, he was replaced by Lieutenant General Patrick Ruthven, who drew up the infantry in checkerboard Swedish formation, which was potentially more effective but also more difficult to control, particularly with inexperienced soldiers. The centre was led in battle by Sergeant Major General Jacob Astley. The left wing consisted of horse under Sir Henry Wilmot, with Lord Digby, the King's Secretary of State, in support and Colonel Arthur Aston's dragoons on his flank. Parliamentarians. The parliamentarian left wing consisted of a loosely organised cavalry brigade of 20 unregimented troops under Sir James Ramsay, supported by 600 musketeers and several cannon, deployed behind a hedge. In the centre, the infantry brigade of Sir John Meldrum was drawn up on the left of the front line and Colonel Charles Essex's brigade on the right. Sir Thomas Ballard's infantry brigade was deployed behind Meldrum and the cavalry regiments under Sir William Balfour and Sir Philip Stapleton behind Charles Essex. The presence of these 2 regiments was to be important in the coming battle. A regiment of infantry under Colonel William Fairfax linked the centre to the right wing. The right wing consisted of the regiment of cavalry under Lord Fielding, posted on some rising ground, with 2 regiments of dragoons in support. Battle. As Essex showed no signs of wishing to attack, the Royalists under Lieutenant General Ruthven began to descend the slope of Edge Hill some time after midday. Even when they had completed this manoeuvre at about 2 o'clock, The battle did not begin until the sight of the king with his large entourage riding from regiment to regiment to encourage his soldiers, apparently goaded the parliamentarians into opening fire. The king's party withdrew out of range and an artillery duel took place. The royalist guns were comparatively ineffective as most of them were deployed some way up the slope, and from this height most of their shot plunged harmlessly into the earth. While the bombardment continued, however, the royalist dragoons advanced on each flank and drove back the parliamentarian dragoons and musketeers covering their wings of horse. In the flanks, Rupert gave the order to attack. As his charge gathered momentum, a troop of parliamentarian horse under faithful Fortescue abruptly defected. The rest of Ramsay's brigade gave an ineffectual volley of pistol fire from the saddle before turning to flee. Rupert's and Byron's troopers rapidly overran the enemy guns and musketeers on this flank and galloped jubilantly in pursuit of Ramsay's men to the detriment of the infantry. Wilmot charged about the same time on the other flank. Fielding's outnumbered regiment quickly gave way, and Wilmot and Digby also chased him to Kineton, where the royalist horse fell out to loot the parliamentarian baggage. Sir Charles Lucas and Lord Grandison rallied about 200 men, but when they tried to charge the parliamentarian rear, they were distracted by fugitives from Charles Essex's routed brigade. The royalist infantry also advanced in the centre under Ruthven. Many of the parliamentarian foot had already run away as their cavalry disappeared, and others fled as the infantry came to close quarters. The brigades of Sir Thomas Ballard and Sir John Meldrum nevertheless stood their ground. The parliamentarian cavalry regiments of Stapleton and Balfour emerged through gaps in the line of parliamentarian foot soldiers, and charged the royalist infantry. With no royalist cavalry to oppose them, they put many units to flight. The king had left himself without any proper reserve. As his centre gave way, he ordered one of his officers to conduct his sons Charles and James to safety while Ruthven rallied his infantry. Some of Balfour's men charged so far into the royalist position that they menaced the prince's escort and briefly overran the royalist artillery, before withdrawing. In the front ranks, Lord Lindsay was killed, and Sir Edmund Verney died defending the royal standard, which was captured by parliamentarian ensign Arthur Young. By this time, some of the royalist horse had rallied and were returning from Kineton. Lt. Colonel Robert Warwickshire of Wilmot's horse recaptured the royal standard by a subterfuge as it was being taken to the parliamentarian rear as a trophy. Welsh also captured 2 parliamentary cannon and, accompanied by Prince Rupert, was knighted on the field by King Charles I next morning. Captain John Smith later claimed a supporting part in the rescue of the royal standard and was accordingly knighted, but the medal was minted in Sir Robert Walsh's name in honour. Sir Robert, when in exile with Prince Charles, committed a grave error of etiquette defending Prince Rupert, and coupled with his friend Prince Rupert's political unpopularity among the royalist exiles and the fact that Walsh was an Irishman, Sir Robert's part at Edge Hill was afterwards denigrated to the benefit of Smith, and thus erroneously perpetuated as the hero in subsequent historical publications. As the light began to fade, the battle ended with a firefight from either side of a dividing ditch, before nightfall eventually brought a natural close to hostilities. The royalists had been forced back to the region they had originally advanced from, but had regrouped. Outcome: during the evening, Charles and most of his army had promptly returned to the Edge Hill escarpment and the Warmington Hills beyond. Similarly, Parliament's army also returned to the shelter of their camp at Little Kineton and Kineton, but both armies kept a significant number of men entrenched as a rearguard in the centre of the battlefield, who cautiously monitored each other's position throughout much of the night. By the early hours of the Monday, the last of the king's men had crept away back to Edge Hill, shortly followed by Parliament's remaining men returning to Kineton. It had been a bitterly cold night with a hard frost. This was suggested by contemporary reports as the reason many of the wounded survived, due to the cold allowing many wounds to congeal, saving the wounded from bleeding to death or succumbing to infection. The following day, both armies partially formed up again, but neither was willing to resume the battle. Charles sent a herald to Essex with a message of pardon if he would agree to the king's terms. But the messenger was roughly handled and forced to return without delivering his message. Although Essex had been reinforced by some of his units which had lagged behind on the march, he withdrew during the evening and the majority of his army marched to Warwick Castle, abandoning 7 guns on the battlefield. In the early hours of Tuesday 25th, Prince Rupert led a strong detachment of horse and dragoons and launched a surprise attack upon what remained of the parliamentarian baggage train at Kineton and dispatched many of the battle's wounded survivors discovered within the village. Essex's decision to return northwards to Warwick allowed the king to continue southwards in the direction of London. Rupert urged this course, and was prepared to undertake it with his cavalry alone. With Essex's army still intact, Charles chose to move more deliberately, with the whole army. After capturing Banbury on the 27th of October, Charles advanced via Oxford, Aylesbury and Reading. Essex meanwhile had moved directly to London, reinforced by the London-trained bands and many citizen volunteers. His army proved to be too strong for the king to contemplate another battle when the Royalists advanced to Turnham Green. The king withdrew to Oxford, which he made his capital for the rest of the war. With both sides almost evenly matched, it would drag on ruinously for years. It is generally acknowledged that the Royalist cavalry's lack of discipline prevented a clear Royalist victory at Edge Hill. Not for the last time in the war, they would gallop after fleeing enemy and then break ranks to plunder, rather than rally to attack the enemy infantry. Byron's and Digby's men in particular were not involved in the first clashes and should have been kept in hand rather than allowed to gallop off the battlefield. In contrast, in the aftermath of the battle, Patrick Ruthven was elevated to the rank of Lord General of the King's Army, confirming his role as acting commander in the battle. The last survivor of the battle, William Heiseland, fought also at Malplaquet 67 years later.